This episode was made possible by our incredible donors. Their faithful support allows us to continue the work of amplifying the voices of religious abuse survivors. We committed early on never to monetize any of the stories, so we rely solely on donations from people like you. If you value the work and are able to contribute, you can become a monthly donor at the link in our show notes. Another way to support Bodies Behind the Bus is by following, rating, and reviewing the podcast. It only takes a moment, but has a tremendous impact on our reach. Thank you for daring to listen.
Hello, and welcome back to the Bodies Behind the Bus podcast. We have an At the Bus Stop episode today that we are super excited about. Today we have Dr. Jared Stacy with us. A doctor is in the house. He is also an author of an upcoming book. He's an ethicist and a theologian. Welcome, Jared.
It is good to be here, Johnna. Thanks for having me. You too, Jay. Thanks for having me on.
I would love to hear just a little bit more about this book that you're working on. Can you share some about that?
Sure, I can. So I was raised in fundamentalist Christianity. So that's the fundamentalist corner of evangelicalism. I went to Liberty and I was in the SBC, and I've come out of a lot of that. And this book is part of my grappling with conspiracy theory in my own personal experience, but also my experience as a pastor, as a former pastor, is what kind of gave rise to my doctoral research into conspiracy theory and evangelicalism at January 6th, and then really like 300 years of American history. So it really is not a topic that I picked off of the shelf of saying, hey, like, what could be the most controversial or even relevant topic? This was something that came out of my own upbringing, my own experience in Christianity in America. I should probably say Christian nationalism. And so this book grapples with where we're at now, but also how we got here. And I think answering the question of how we got here is really important for answering the question, where do we go next and how do we move forward? And so I think that's what the book is kind of set up to do, is give people a broader look at how conspiracy theory has always kind of been used in evangelical Christianity to narrate the world around us. Many of us are familiar with this. And so I talk about Columbine. I talk about some of the 9/11 conspiracy theories. I kind of bridge all of that, though, to talk about this moment. And it's a moment that I'm calling like disreality. This moment where there's so many different realities that people we know and love are bound up in, and they're all colliding. What one person says is real, not just what they say is real, what they act or believe in. That all of this is colliding, and it's where we all know this, so it's difficult to try and find language to do that. But that's what the book is at. It's in this moment, kind of looking backwards to try and also look ahead.
I am so excited for this book to come out. I agree with you that we need to be able to honestly assess what got us here so that we can make wise steps forward and understand what a step forward even looks like. So we don't make the same steps forward that we've been making.
Exactly.
Before we get into the conversation, which, spoiler alert, this is what we're going to be talking about for this episode, I do want to give you a Substack plug. So Jared's book is going to be coming out hopefully around next spring. And if you want to stay up to date on when that's going to drop, when pre-orders become available, and also see some of the deeper dives into current events or things that Jared is working through, go subscribe to his Substack. We're going to link that in the show notes. It's called the Homeward Dispatches, and there's a ton of great content there. So go support Jared and his work there.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, Jared, I am so excited to have you on to talk a little bit about this current moment. And something that Jay and I have been talking about a lot is how the work with Bodies Behind the Bus and abuse and the culture that allows for abuse in Western evangelical spaces is really relevant to the conversation of Christian nationalism, because we think that there's a through line there with the tactics and the levers that are pulled by power brokers in order to get people in line. There's a lot of the similar tactics with coercion, but also this idea of people being meaning makers and creating these different realities or different meanings within scripture that are really adding to this culture of Christian nationalism becoming normalized. How would you say conspiracy theories fit into that conversation?
That's a really good question, Johnna. I think first, I want to just affirm all across the board the connection that this podcast is making between cultures of abuse and political conspiracy theories. While some of us who've navigated these spaces, like I have, and I know you both have, it's kind of intuitive, like, oh, of course. But from the outside looking in, it's not as easily parsed. And I just want to say, from a former pastor standpoint, someone who's navigated these kind of situations myself, there is an absolute connection here. And I think the root of this connection is really narration. It's really storytelling. And the person who, in terms of abuse cover-ups, the person who kind of controls the narrative is wielding the power. And so when you kind of connect that though to our current political moment, Trump's word in many ways is creating, and for the last 10 years, we have to wrestle with the fact that MAGA has been in ascendancy for the last decade, maybe 15 years, to the point where now there are voters who don't remember anything really prior to that. So we are grappling with this chaotic moment where any kind of story that gives coherence and certainty is attractive. And even if it doesn't meet certain rational criteria, it's still useful. So I use that word. It's still useful. It's got utility for organizing like a church, for organizing a society. And so that sort of utility, when you start to tell a different story, other things become threatened. And that's why survivors taking to the internet to share their experiences and tell the truth is seen as, those are keyboard warriors or things like that, when it's really a contested space of, well, who gets to be the storyteller here? And I think that's the kind of the connection is really the power of story.
I observe the internet. That's how I tell Johnna. So social media, I'm an observer. I don't know if I'm a contributor. And
I'm the front lines of the podcast on the internet.
Yeah.
There needs to be a both and. Yeah, there needs to be a both and.
But what's fascinated me since, I was alive during Columbine. I was in high school during Columbine. I remember Columbine. I remember some of those conspiracy theories about Columbine. I definitely remember the conspiracy theories that came out 9/11, especially ones that were coming out from the church. But what I've been fascinated since, I would say 2015, 2014 with the church and Trump, when Trump really came out, and then is I would call it the devolving of moral clarity has become so fast and rampant in churches to where I'm seeing things that pastors are saying online that I was like, they wouldn't have said this 10 years ago. And like to just see, like case in point, like they had a pastor in Texas who's like celebrating that his school like was the lowest vaccinated school in the state of Texas. And like he was celebrating that and like almost like mocking people. Like in my opinion, he was mocking. And I just was like, he's bought into some shit that like he really believes, and that man is on the pulpit shaping and moving the congregation to believe and think away. And I was even thinking like 10 years ago, even like some of those guys who were on the far right, who in the back room supported Trump, still walked in with a I guess a line of like, we're not going to go all the way. They don't even care anymore. And I guess from your perspective, like that shift to where we're not even hiding it, right? How does that play into this world to where we're now getting more, did you say multiple realities, or what was your term there? Yeah.
Yeah, like disreality. And
Disreality. Yeah.
I think for a lot of people, even just the word reality just kind of functions as like that should end the conversation. And we know from experience inside evangelicalism that just like people who maybe they're not Christian, they kind of say, "Oh, reality is like that's where the facts are." But in this inside the church, you have a very similar thing of just biblical. Like that's biblical, and that means the end of the conversation. There's no unpackaging biblical and giving it. What do you mean when you say that? So I think for a lot of people, one of the things I'm trying to do is give language to this shift of like, how can we talk about this? Because when you look at people sitting in the pews who are in many ways like receiving this message as conspiracy theory baked into Christianity, here's what happens. And one of my favorite journalists right now that's covering this sort of late creeping fascism is Jeff Charlotte. He has this great line. He's been to Trump rallies, and he has this line: "You cannot fact check a myth." And the limits of fact checking are really right here for us to see, because what happens when you start kind of baking these alternative or transgressive forms of knowledge about vaccines and all of this stuff, when it kind of comes packaged to you as the Christian story, like this is what good Christians, biblical Christians believe. The problem or the reality of that is that fact checking doesn't work in that kind of scenario. You're actually really dealing with theology. You're really dealing with needing to separate this kind of form of knowledge from what is Christian knowledge. What does it mean to know as a Christian? And that's what my work is trying to set up to do, is give people permission to say, what an epidemiologist says we can handle and not risk our faith. And so being able to separate those two together is really where a Christian ethic actually can start to be born. But it's really difficult to talk to people about what a Christian ethic might be or what Christian morality might be when you have pastors, and this is kind of my final observation to your question, is that you have pastors who are more committed to the sort of morality that makes America work a certain way than a morality that is a witness to Christ. And when you start to make the difference between, well, what do we need to say? How do we need to narrate things in order to make our vision of America, quote unquote, work, versus what are the actions that we are called to give a witness to Christ to our world? Those are two divergent paths. The task of making America work, or again, and I would kind of lay that onto make America great again, right? So we want to contribute to our society. We want to be positive and share these common problems. But what we're finding is that these conspiracies and these kind of transgressive ways of thinking about things are being packaged into a Christian story that's already very scandalous. And so people kind of say, well, Christianity's a conspiracy theory. And once you say that, then everything's on the table. And I think that's a really important point, because that's the language that's out there. That's what I saw as a pastor. And so in some ways, I want to very clearly say, I think it's pastoral malpractice to really give people permission to say, well, Christianity is kind of a conspiracy theory. That's going to appeal to a kind of person who's already kind of leaning into a very corrosive form of suspicion.
I'm blown away that there's not more attention to how, I know there's attention to Christian nationalism right now, but how rampant it is in the churches, and how leaders are not only like supporting it, but they are full on shifting and changing narratives to reflect a more America-centric gospel. And every Sunday. And why are we not sounding the alarm bells to be like, hey, we've seen this play out before in other countries. We can go back 100 years and see where this goes. But we're not. Why? What is the, I guess I'm appealing to your former pastor side here. Yeah. Even spending time in theology, why are there not men and women? Well, in the SBC, it's just men. But why are there not other people? Maybe if there were women, they'd be saying stuff like this. But why are there not people that, I'm sure there are people that don't believe this stuff and they see the writing on the walls. Why are they not speaking up?
Well, Can I ask one,
Yeah.
like, put one little point in there with that?
Yeah.
I don't think it's just other countries. I think it's really easy for us to be like, this has happened in other countries, but I actually, the more I've like sat and stared at this, especially this last year, I'm like, this is just us. Like, this
Maybe.
is the
Yeah, that's
United
probably right.
States
Yeah.
forever. Like, we have utilized the church in the US, the white evangelical church in particular in the US, has utilized these same levers. It's just we have gotten more and more into positions of power within the government
That's a good
with
point.
that, I think.
Well, and
So
I'm
I
not
think
even,
these have all been tools that have been being utilized in the church.
Yeah.
and I'm not even saying like I don't believe in the SBC at all. Like I don't stand for anything they stand for. I don't even know why it exists, especially with all the abuse allegations. But what I would say is like I would think there is some within institutions, that being one of them, that don't buy into the conspiracies, that maybe buy into more of a hardline Christianity, but they're like, yeah, the conspiracy stuff is just too far for me. Why are they not saying stuff?
Yeah.
Or am I missing it? Or
No, I don't think you are. I think this is where Jesus' teaching on wealth is just really, really pointed and really sharp. That's the cutting edge. You lose everything. I mean, you do. In an institution that's built up the way that we've built up our religious institutions, which are economic ventures just as much as they're kingdom ventures, there's a whole lot of material incentive that's baked into that. That might sound cynical, but I think if we had time to sit down and like I could tell my story in full, or you talk to survivors who've walked out of these spaces, like there's a material cost associating with this. And I think in some ways too, like we've forgotten even outside of this country. So, there's always the question of, well, should we look to the confessing church in Germany as inspiration for an analogy for this moment? But there was not, it fizzled out. Most of the pastors took the oath to Hitler in Germany. When you look at even America, and I appreciate John's point on this, I think there's a healthy way of saying this has always been us. There's always been this sort of teetering towards authoritarianism, and that's kind of baked into democracy. But when you look at America, so I'll give you just a really specific example about conspiracies and evangelicalism, going back to when historians kind of say, hey, this is when it started. About 30 years before the American Revolution, there was these great revivals that swept the colonies that were known as the Great Awakenings. And for those who are familiar with like QAnon seized on that idea of a Great Awakening and said, hey, the third Great Awakening is coming. So for even people who grew up kind of in a revivalistic type of church, QAnon right now appeals to this really primal sense of what it means to be white evangelical in America. Like, oh, of course I want revival. Of course we should want to see that kind of stuff. And the question is never asked, well, what sort of Jesus is this revival for? And a lot of times we have a paranoid Jesus, a Jesus who's, speaking out of two sides of his mouth, endorsing rampant American militarism and our economic systems, while at the same time saying like, I'm here to make America work. George Whitefield was an evangelist who went around preaching all the way through the American colonies. He owned slaves, and he opened up an orphanage to fund his missionary kind of excursions all through the colonies. In my research, I examined some of his sermons, and he would go and he would preach to enslaved people with their masters present. And what he would do is he would preach a gospel. So he wasn't supposed to preach to enslaved people at all. So he was still bucking the trend. But the problem was that he was only going so far. He still left the economic institution of chattel slavery intact, and he was a beneficiary from it. But the conspiracy theory of his day was that there were going to be slave revolts, armed uprisings. And one of his kind of co-evangelists went and preached to the white residents of Charleston that if you don't repent, he said, God is going to send, he said, quote, African hosts, which he was referencing enslaved gatherings of Christians outside of Charleston, that God was actually going to send them as judgment, on these white people if they didn't repent. So that was in 1730-ish. If you look at some of Billy Graham's sermons in the 1950s, like, unless America repents, we're going to become communist. it's the same sort of way that conspiracy theory kind of kickstarts. It's kind of like this nos into the engine, so to speak, that really gives this gospel urgency and relevancy. But at the core of it, it's more about making society work than it is about letting society receive from God what it's supposed to receive. So again, this idea of making America work is at the heart of these conspiracy theories, these stories that people tell. And deeper in that, it's just our material lives. It's our material possessions. We tell these stories because we don't want to be dispossessed, not only of certainty, but also dispossessed of our own lives, our economics, our possessions. It's all at stake. It's all at stake in these stories that we tell.
Yeah, that's great.
And when you say make America work, you mean work within the framework or perspective of white, powerful men.
Yes.
Right? Like all to
make
that
America
end.
work for us, right? And who's the us? It's the white, and back in Whitfield's day, it was the white slave owner, property owning, male. That. And so when I say make America work, the asterisk is like, for some. Not for all, for the rich, for the, so it's always those asterisks. Make America great again. For who? And then when you see our president kind of patting his buddies on the back for tanking the stock market and saying, hey, like, it'd be a good idea to buy today, so his friends can get rich, right? Like, that's make America work for those people. And the church has never been about that task. The church has always been, it's like, how do we make society, how do we contribute to society in such a way that the poor, the marginalized are uplifted? And that's why Jesus says they're blessed. Not because poverty is inherently more holy, but because it's closer to the recognition that God is all we need and all we have. And that is what the church in America has forgotten. And that's what our conspiracy theories press down. That's what they press down.
Do you feel like the church in America and at large has ever known that? Like, is it something we forgot, or is it something we never believed?
I think when we talk about the church, there's always going to be varied expressions and communities. And it's the African American church has in the United States been the carrier of this sort of faithfulness and this sort of witness. So yes. And then the question is, I never went to an African American church. I never heard these things until the Spirit brought me into places that I did not choose, and brought me through situations that I would not want to go through, to realize what I didn't know, and to realize that you never know. You just have to keep learning. And that sense of certainty, God just ruins that. And so, I think that African American church has known that, has possessed that knowledge, has worked and lived from that knowledge, and to the detriment of the white church in America, we have told stories that in some ways can express our angst. Like, I want to be honest, like, conspiracy theories are a way for people who have developed distrust to attempt to narrate that. And so, like, that's where I kind of get on this cutting edge of saying, what's going on when people are sharing these things? It's more than what meets the eye. I think that's something, I mean, you guys have heard conspiracy theories. Like, do you get the sense that when someone's sharing this, that they're not just talking about what's happening. They're trying to narrate evil. They're trying to be a moral person, even if some of it sounds wild. Do you get that sense? Can we at least get to that point?
Yeah. I think also, like, you can see it in, like, I think the visual arts, music, music and film have been, and I'm speaking from a perspective of like a white-centered place, have been a place where we've worked those things out, where we've tried to narrate how we feel and how we interact with good and evil. And conspiracies, especially if you just watch movies, like, they're at the center of a lot of movies, or they're a plot line. So I think, like, I agree. Like, I think our society was born on it, and in a way, we've profited each time we've had one. Like, it's reaped rewards for us at the cost of someone else, and at least another people group. So I 100% agree with you there. And I think that that's what makes it hard, is that it's hard to wake up from that. And it's hard to even see anything different because this is a generational thing. Like, this is not something that just happened overnight. My concern, though, is that it feels like it's ramped up to a level to where it's either you're in or you're out. And if you're out, like if you don't believe in it and you're out, then the Christian aspect that is coming into this is, well, now you're, you know, a demon, or you're possessed, or you're in judgment of hell, and you're against us, and we can't have anybody be against us. And like, I don't know how to bridge that. Like, that to me is the frightening part, is that it's become this anger and tone that it's like, if your mom or dad believes it and you don't, that may be it. Like, you may not, they may not want to talk to you anymore. So I don't know. I don't know if I have a question with that, but that's, I think, my concern, is that it feels like it's at such a fever pitch to where it doesn't feel like there's room for conversations.
Yeah. I think you're naming, for many of us, just pain. And we've been in this moment of disreality for so long, and the news cycle and the speed of information is such that being able to account for the loss, I mean, in some ways, that's what I hope my book is able to do, is give language and space for that kind of mourning, and that kind of fracturing. I mean, I saw it as a pastor, and I saw it splitting families and kitchen tables and church communities. And we've all seen it. And everyone, and I want to like affirm that everyone does like rightly kind of want, like, what are we supposed to do? Like, how do we, and I think really the first thing is just, it's appropriate to grieve and mourn, some loss of common ground, some loss of, the ability to talk. And from that place of pain, it can be really easy to lash out and say things like pathologize people. And I think that's something that I've wrestled with and grappled with in talking about this in public, is how do we raise this crisis? How do we enter this crisis while refusing to hold others in contempt, while recognizing that the sort of disreality that's swirling around us does have consequences beyond just like politics as a hobby horse? Like, people are being not just deported, but disappeared. Like, these are the things that are happening on the outer edges of society. And I know many people, like, for example, right now would look at things like, screening international students for various political views and saying, well, now I was an international student in the UK, and the reality that the government could, in many ways, just, I hope people see that it may not be centered on you at this moment, but some of us, it may never be centered on us because of the way that we look, because of the tax bracket that we're in, because of the jobs that we have. And so I think it's really important. And that's what the church as a community is supposed to do, is actually be the place where these stories and these slogans and these narratives are actually emptied of their power in our midst. But unfortunately, they're being supercharged. And they're being supercharged not just through overt, like, there are some really clear on-ramps. Let me be very clear about this. Like, there's some really clear on-ramps to conspiratorial thinking, to baking conspiracy into Christianity through like huge organizations. Turning Point USA is one, Theos U. Like, there's these ideas that percolate kind of on the edges, that you start to say, well, this is Jesus, and this is kind of what it means to be biblical, and we don't have the time to separate that. But then, so it's not just overt, and it's also silence too. It's just churches that say, we don't talk politics here, and that leaves politics then off the table. Then you can choose to believe any conspiracy theory that you want. But the challenge with this, and I'll just I want to hear from you guys, but the challenge with this is that for many pastors, they don't have the time, the energy, or the desire, or the ability to be a fact checker. And that's what we think we have to be to fix this. And I think what I want to suggest is that the subversive power of the Christian story is sufficient to serve as a buffer between us and the conspiracy theories that make things, that claim to reveal things. And so I'll just kind of quote Brian Brock. he has this great statement. He's a fellow ethicist, and he says that the only thing that the church knows that the world doesn't is who sustains it. And that completely flips things on its head, because we as Christians, if you're raised in evangelicalism, we all have this sense that apologetics is like means we have to have all the answers. But what if we started to think like, no, the one thing that we know, that we confess, is that Jesus is Lord. But that doesn't get stretched over everything, in the sense that, you know what goes on behind closed doors. The Christian knowledge is not omniscience. Christian knowledge is not omniscience, but that's what's happening when people are kind of sharing conspiracy theory as an expression of their faith. That's what's happening.
When you mention like Turning Point or TheosU, I think Prager can be in there.
Yeah, that's another good one.
What has been interesting is watching pastors who, when I was in the thick of it, they were like the edgy pastors. So like Matt Chandler was the edgy dude when I was like really in it. Like he was the cool one.
Yep.
Which,
oh yeah. Yeah.
You know, people know where we stand on that as a podcast now. But like he headlined TheosU's conference one year. Like it has been so like brought into the forefront of evangelicalism. I think Matt is probably considered like pretty vanilla now at this point in the grand scape of things. And like vanilla Matt, who again has his own problems, you've heard about them on the podcast, is like headlining this conference that is filled with people that were like, wasn't TheosU part of the like worship revival Sean Foyt stuff that was going on too? Or was it not him?
I don't know. Potentially. So some of my like what you're talking about with like Sean Foyt and that, I mean, it's this whole network. It's this whole ecosystem. And so there's different pools that people are playing in. I think we can say enough to be confident. Like, like there are certain influences and connections between TheosU and those sort of movements. And I think what's really difficult is in a political moment where like certainty is such a credit to make America great again. I think the challenge is that the church is moving at the speed of politics, and it's moving at the speed of this moment. And really, it's not like there's a lack of answers. It's not like there's a lack of a word. There is a word. But the church's attention to that word is being silenced by a rogue word, like by Trump, who's organizing all of this stuff. And when Johnna, when you talk about revival, I don't think we're prepared to really wrestle with the fact that a resurgence in religion and a resurgence in Christianity in America, that the data shows us. So this is where kind of the conspiracy theory comes in, and we think, well, we can just unseat conspiracies with data. We can't even prove our faith with data. That if we were to go back into a time machine, which is impossible, if we were to stand there and witness the crucifixion of Jesus, by the logics and the stories told of that day, you and I would all conclude like, oh, this was just an insurrectionist who'd been murdered by Rome. That passing that line from the meaning of an event to faith, data does not render that for us. It doesn't do that for us. And so that sounds really disheartening to people who are like, wait a minute, you mean I can't like share data to help unseat people from conspiracy theory? I'm like, no. I'm not saying that. I'm saying there's a place for data, but reality is more than data. Like God's reality is more than what the data says. And so when there's talk of revival, when there's whispers of revival, when people point to the data and say, look at the youth who are flocking to TheosU or Turning Point USA, we have to be attentive enough to the word, to who Jesus is, to say, and what sort of Jesus is being held up in their midst? Because Antichrist can be lifted up and worshiped in a way that's impossible to distinguish except by our fruit. So then that invites the question, what are the fruit of these movements? Where are they asking people to put their hope and their trust and their security? And it's in America. It's in making America great again. Because when you cross that line and you start to criticize tariffs or the administration in any way, shape, or form, then those are the stakes. And that's revealing. That means to me that the church's attention to the word of Christ has been kind of supplanted from this attention to a rogue word and our captivity to data and to facts. I'm not saying they're wrong, but I'm saying that they're limited in their ability to cultivate attention to who God is and what he's doing among us. And that's a uniquely Christian way of approaching the problem.
I have a question that while you were talking, it kind of sparked this question. I'm not sure exactly how it flows into the conversation.
Sure, no, we can follow
but
it.
Some of the conversations that I've been having surrounding Christian nationalism, abuse, and the through lines that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation has been that rural America has been largely left out of the conversation, yet I feel like that is where a majority of radicalization is happening. And I want to know what you're seeing on your side of things with conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
In regards to the church in rural America, the white evangelical church in rural America, and how are conspiracy theories being utilized in those spaces to create extremism and for political gain? And it's actually targeting people that are oppressed, like rural, poor white Americans that are experiencing oppression in our country.
And that's a really good question. And I think the whole point of following Jesus and the way that he brings our attention onto things that we otherwise might not give our attention to, I think is precisely the sort of, we can't be reactive in this moment, even though everything in us wants to be. And conspiracy theories are that kind of reactivity of like, well, let's blame this person or that person. So, to that question of like rural America and the stories that are told, I've been doing a lot of thinking about Steinbeck and about Grapes of Wrath. And for those who are not familiar and are not going to go read a novel, and that's totally fine. Grapes of Wrath followed, poor rural Americans who were being displaced from their farms in the Midwest through overfarming, but also through a complete, economic overturn where big corporations were coming up and mechanizing farm equipment and buying farmland. That's a huge generalization, but he followed these who they basically became, vagabonds, like going around the country. And it's the story of this family and how they provide for each other, but the challenges that they face along the way. I really think that Steinbeck is resonant now. That idea of what America has always sort of done to the working class. And I think before we pathologize people for attempting to relate their problems to express dissent, I think we need to be able to adjust and of course, there's always this very progressive sense where, those aren't the facts, and there's this sense of contemptuous enlightenment on the left in America that leaves the working class behind. And so I think that question is spot on. I think that in the vacuum of any very clear economic policy to help the working class in America in these rural communities. So I saw it in Scotland too. Scotland wanted to go and be independent. And the concern was that Edinburgh, Aberdeen, and Glasgow were going to kind of get all the focus if they were to become independent, leaving rural Scots. And it's the same in the States in many ways. And so all that to say, I think conspiracy theories can be a very easy way for people to express their frustration with the lack of representation. But what happens is those conspiracy theories are taken and kind of used to delegitimize their very real political claims. So speaking as a churchman, speaking as a theologian, I think my first question would be, does the church see itself as a place where those conspiracies are sort of reinforced? Or does the church see itself as we are part of what it means for someone's political claim to reach us? Like, yes, in a democracy, we have a political claim. We make a claim on our representatives. Like, you're supposed to represent us. But in a kingdom sense, each of our neighbors has a legitimate claim on our lives. And that's a political claim. We are responsible to them, for them, just like they're responsible to and for us. I think that's really easy to see in Jesus's teachings, especially when he's like, hey, if the Roman tells you to carry their pack for a mile, you go too. And unfortunately, we turned a teaching about encountering the oppressor, really rendering the oppressor as a human being, right? Because if you go a second mile, what are they saying? Like, there's the story that Rome is oppressing us. I'm kind of getting on my soapbox here because this is a good question. But that teaching of saying, like, go the second mile, force this Roman oppressor to see you as a human being and you see him as a human being, that's a different sort of politics. And so I think in many ways, churches in rural America, not all have been this place where conspiracies have been sewn up, but to your point, it is the soil of radicalization, like political dissent, political frustration. And that's exactly what the Grapes of Wrath was attempting to show the public in the 1930s, was that the way that we are treating these farmers across the greater Midwest, that's how fascism rises, is this idea that you can mobilize the working class without changing property relations. And that's getting into the scholarship, but that's fascism. And so your question, to answer it very, very pointedly and not as long-winded as I just did, is yes. And that's how fascism starts.
I was fascinated with the tariff dialogue where, you had the tariffs come out, and the world has seen tariffs fail time and time again. Yeah. We've seen them fail. But I was fascinated to watch those that were defending the tariffs and to see, especially when the economy was just, and it's still not, we're still in trouble. But especially as the downturn happened and the panic happened, to see people respond in a way to the tariffs that it reminded me kind of what you're saying, to where they were buying into this conspiracy of like, God has this, and Trump knows what he's doing. Capitalists always win, and some of them were very angry. Like, you don't know how to, if you're, I saw one person say, like, you don't know how, if your 401k's down, like, you don't know how to invest correctly, like illogical things that like mystified me. I was like, this is crazy. But when you're talking about that, like what you were just saying, like, that to me is a misreality, to where those individuals, they've so bought into a narrative to where God is controlling Trump and Trump is controlling the economy, and that whatever Trump does, he has a vision or a plan from God. And I'm not making this shit up. Like, this, people think this.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
Like,
I know.
And then when there's something that happens that they don't back from it, they double down on it. They double down. They keep doubling down. And like, to me, like, as you were talking, I just keep thinking about like how I love to look at those individuals and say, like, there is some pain and hurt that they're experiencing, maybe from an economical level that we don't understand or can't see. And yet I feel like the church could be in a place in those communities where they bridge that gap, where they step in and say, like, the community is experiencing unemployment because of the plant leaving or because of layoffs, and the church being able to have a narrative and have a conversation with the community that helps unseat some of that soil, or pour some fertilizer on those weeds that are growing to potentially do that. I just don't see that. Like, I don't see that happening. I see it sometimes happening online, but I don't see it happening in a broader sense. I see more of people from the church standing up and saying, yeah, we believe that. That is happening. Like, we are getting layoffs, and we need, Trump's got a vision, and this is Trump's vision, and we're going to get there. We just got to get through it. And I don't know if there's an answer for the church to make that shift. I don't know if it can in America. I don't think it ever has, except with the exception of like the Black church. But is it possible for the church to become that? Has it ever even been that? And can it become a place to where it is a safety net to say, point people back toward a different way?
That is the question. And I think, yes, I think the answer is yes. I think it can. And the question is, and I'm thinking of, I'm a dad. So I'm thinking maybe in my kids' time, Like the decisions we're making now as a family of saying, okay, like where do we want to spend the next 10 years, 15 years? Like what could reasonably occur? I think in many ways it's probably happening in ways that we're not noticing, just because it's not this news drawing. Until there's a victory, there's not really any news worth reporting. And I think there is a lot of that type of communal, but so long as I think the church sees itself as an institution that it has to defend, so long as churches see themselves as like survival strategies of like these policies have to serve us, then I don't think it's prepared to risk what it'll take to start being an advocate for the common problems in it's in our community. So I think that there's an economic question there. Like there's an economic tension. Did Jesus really mean what he said? You know, when he said that the flowers are clothed and that the birds have homes. And let's be very clear, that seems incredibly arbitrary and totally dangerous advice to follow unless you put it in the context of God's care. Unless you're willing to test that and be faithful to it, you will never meet, you know, a financial advisor who works with Dave Ramsey that'll tell you that's good advice. You'll never hear that.
No. Something I've been thinking about. You won't.
No.
You just won't. Something I've been thinking about a lot. And again, when we're talking about the church right now, we're specifically talking about the white evangelical church in America. I have really been grappling with, like, is that faith even compelling? And I don't think it is. Like, the faith that is being sold in white American evangelical spaces is not compelling. Hence why conspiracy theories they're more compelling than the Jesus of the white American church. And I believe that the example of the Black church in America, and I believe the example of survivors that choose integrity at great cost to themselves, that faith in Jesus is compelling. So what I wonder and ponder on quite a bit when it comes to where we're at and what does this look like for us to all be in this Christian nationalist hellscape that we're living in right now? Like, what is the way out? And I don't know if there is capacity for that within white evangelical American spaces at all. Like, I think it's going to be like, I don't know if it can, outside of like the lightning bolt of God coming in. And I don't think it's going to be the same voices because we don't know. All of us on this call have stared at this, and Jared, you've stared at it through scholarship and study, yet we were raised in a space that sold a faith in a Jesus that for the most part is not congruent with the character of the God of the Bible. So what, like, I don't know that there's a way for these like mega church white spaces to actually change, because I don't think they know another way. Because I don't know that Jesus and faith in Jesus actually exists in those institutions. And I feel I'm not trying to sound elitist when I say that. I'm not trying to say like that you can't have faith in Jesus and be in one of those institutions. But I do think that at a certain point you hit a fork in the road where do you really believe in Jesus or not? And if you do believe in Jesus, then you're going to have to ask some really hard questions. Or like, what are we doing?
We have a catalog of episodes where those questions were asked for survivors and the church turned the other way. I mean, that's happening everywhere.
And I feel like one of the things that I had to, coming out of evangelicalism, that I had to grapple with, and maybe you guys can relate, is this sense of wanting to repair. You know, the work of repair, the activism of repair. And then I realized that that's not what I wanted to, just not inside of me. Like I had this realization, but through conversations with colleagues and through attending other churches outside of the country, like realizing maybe I don't want to spend the rest of my life like fighting over, if I could put it really bluntly, like it is just a damned label. That the idea of contesting the label evangelical as sort of like a brand revival, like I'm not interested in rebranding. I'm not going to spend my life for and in that interest. It is nothing.
You're not
but a label.
like the PR guy for evangelicalism.
Exactly. None of us. And if there's something about evangelicalism that when you kind of step out and into the margins or even outside of it, that you kind of are at risk for retaining a lot of its impulses. And that's one of them, right? Like, oh, we can do this. And I think in some ways, that's always like playing a card game with cards under the table. That's not really playing all your cards. You're like saying, to quote an atheist, Nietzsche says, only where there are graves can there be resurrections. Now, he wanted to put Christianity in the grave, but other theologians who engaged with Nietzsche said, hey, you were more right than you knew, buddy. And maybe you had some good critiques of the European Christianity. And that's besides the point. But my point in sharing that with evangelicalism and this like fork in the road of what do we do now is I think many of us those who have never been in these spaces and those who have found their way out of these spaces can see very clearly that sometimes coming to faith is also experienced as an apostasy. And until we're able to grapple with the cost of that, like apostasy, like Paul meeting Jesus on the road of Damascus was repentance, but it was also a sort of apostasy from the faith that he was practicing. And until we're able to grapple with that and really weigh like Jesus's words to be born again to Nicodemus, those have been reduced and flattened. And it's not like a one mechanical pray the prayer. I mean, that was me. And in some ways I just kind of would say, look, if anyone can change, like anybody can change if I can change. And I don't feel like I've changed totally, right? But like that sense of Luther's first thesis was all of life is conversion. And I feel like over the last 5 years, all that's happened in my life is being converted over and over and over again. And being unsettled and being ruined and recognizing that ruin and that risk is actually freedom. And that's precisely what conspiracy theory baked into Christianity is trying to push down in a way. Like we know, we know. And the minute that you say, I don't know, but I trust, then you get into some really difficult stuff because that's what abusers also want you to say. And so it gets into this really perilous venture of faith, but coming out from under an abuser like Hagar saying, I know where I've come from, but I don't know where I'm going. That's what it feels like. And I think that's the testimony of survivors, but I also think that's the testimony of kids who maybe just survived being raised in an evangelicalism that had you thinking, because this was my experience, that one day I was going to be asked, are you a Christian at gunpoint in my school cafeteria? Yeah. I can't tell you how many times that story, that narrative framed my devotion to Jesus. And so I kind of say all that to say, I don't know if I have like a really solid answer in terms of do this X, Y, Z, but I hope in some ways that I can at least give language to what it looks like to leave, to that leaving can be freedom, that risk and that ruin can actually just be part of, there's this Dutch resistance pastor who, when the Nazis occupied Amsterdam, which is where Anne Frank was during World War II, for those who are history buffs, this pastor said he celebrated the ruin of the church in Amsterdam. He said that the era of pious church life is at an end. And he just had a funeral for the church. Said, all right, it's over. Like, our rot has been exposed. We have not resisted the way that we should have. But then he has this line that says, the church is the church by faith in becoming the church again and again. That's not rebranding. That's not huddle the executive pastors and our brand managers together and putting a better face forward and putting a post on social media. That's like ruin. And that's where things are born. So if that sounds like preaching, it is. And I think the reason it sounds like that is because there's a whole world of a difference in being liberated from a rogue word, and finding yourself face to face with a living word that demands your life. And that's risky and that's ruinous, and that'll look different for each of us as we figure out, I think, what it looks like to be responsible. But I want to land this by just suggesting, because I get asked all the time, like, how do you talk to people who are like in this? Like, how do you frame that? And before I answer, I'm kind of curious to hear from you both. Like, what have you learned from answering kind of conspiracy theories or getting into those kind of conversations?
I mean, I think the first thing is just to listen, more than anything, to show active listening. Like, I'm listening and trying to, try not to say anything right away. Because typically I when people are in those places, because I mean, I've been in those places before too, there is something that is going on in their life that has impacted them, that they are connecting to this conspiracy theory or this belief in a way that is giving them some sort of hope. And that hope is usually directed toward, sometimes it's directed toward things that are negative and because they don't know any different, or because that's just how they've grown up and they've been raised. And so giving that attention to listening to the story and asking questions about the story, I think, are important. I think we make a mistake by always trying to say, like, I've got to prove a point, like in this conversation. It's more about, to me, just connection with the individual and connecting with the fact that they're experiencing something that I don't have language for, and they may not have language for yet, but I want to be present in the conversation. So
that's good.
I will say that I have had to do a lot of studying in this, because my gut is to freak the heck out when I hear something crazy, especially with God's name attached to it. Like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. That's not logical. This does not add up. This does not look like Jesus. That is heresy. Like, that's my gut. You've got, all of our listeners have heard me do that before. But I've been really pressing into looking at de-radicalization work, de-escalation, depolarization lately. I actually just sent over a little free e-course to our board at Sacred Wilderness about depolarizing within that this organization, Braver Angels, does. That it was so good, and it's free. I'll link it in the show notes.
That'd be great
if any of you want to do it. But something I've been really wrestling with is that the cognitive dissonance that gets turned on in people, where it literally doesn't matter what you say. If you trigger that in someone, you're just actually further pushing them into the conspiracy theory or the belief or the extremism. So I will not say I'm good at it. I won't say I've learned this talking to people and now I'm an expert, but I wish I was. But I do think that it has made me be more mindful, especially with loved ones, which I think many of us can probably say we have loved ones that are buying into at least some of this, if not full sail in it, is asking questions that, it comes back to, again, when I've been thinking through this, like, through line of how are these things all connected, this is something that we encourage survivors to do in high control religious spaces. And now, like, reframing this to, we're dealing with cult mindset at a national scale right now, but inspire curiosity, be a person that's safe to be curious with, to the extent that you can. And I think especially those of us on this call, or the majority of our listeners that are coming out of white American evangelical spaces, we have the privilege to do that. Like, we can put our bodies on the line to sit and listen to the garbage.
Right.
Like, it's not there. We can be that. So that's kind of something I've been working through, and also working through really hard how to see the humanity in the people in front of me, and to not let go of that. Because I think once we allow, and I'm seeing the rise of it on the left, like quickly, the dehumanization of the far right. And I think once we get into that space where we're allowing dehumanizing rhetoric, where we're talking about other human beings as if they are dirt, or giving them labels, even. I think even labels, like I've been working not to call people abusers, because that's not who that person is. They're actually an image bearer of God who is abusive. So some of that is, I don't know if that answers your question, but this is some of the stuff that I've been wrestling with. Like, how do I, as someone who still believes in Jesus, walk in this and model Jesus to the people around me? And it's hard.
Yeah. I mean, I love that question, because too, it reflects the relationships that each of us are responsible for. And I want people to hear in some ways too that, you know, and I'm probably more at risk of this because I studied it, is like turning this into like an academic exercise or an intellectual test. And that's risky for a lot of reasons. The first being that no one's a project in that way, like this, and we're dealing with real lives. We're dealing with real consequences of these things. And I think the language that we use in many ways, like our words build worlds, and those worlds can hem us in, or they can reflect God's word and what he's doing. And so I think it is important that, so there's this novelist that I talk about in my book. Her name is Rebecca West. She was writing, and I'll just kind of maybe leave with this or contribute this on my side of things with this question, is that she said she was trying to describe how World War I happened. We're not going to go back and do a history lesson on that, but it was really complex. And they were all Christian nations, by the way. That's one of my favorite things to point out, is like every single major nation in World War I was a Christian nation. So that's Christian nationalism. That's what it does. But she said, I'll never be able to explain it. She said, it's not that there weren't enough facts. It's that there were too many. And the challenge for our day, 100 years on from that, is that we have so many facts, so many different facts. And the stories that we tell about our world are leading us to gravity in particular ways, looking at these facts as consequential and these facts as not. And in so much information, I want to give people, and Jay, I think you said it, and Johnna, you did too, the curiosity, the willingness to engage in conversation in a way that we dispossess ourselves of the need to be right immediately. It's not that we're ceding that there's no such thing as truth with a capital T. It's not that but more importantly, we're leaving this door open that we ourselves do not possess all the facts. And I think that that's a really healthy common ground and place to be. But I want to encourage people to, this is an active, like, we have not found anything that can be scaled to really de-radicalize from conspiracy theory. And one of the things that is not really often talked about is the way that religious belief is baked into these things. So what I'm really focused on is how do we talk about Jesus? That's theology. Like, how do we talk about God? How do we do theology in a way that allows for this separation between these conspiratorial narratives and how we talk about God? And I think that that's a work that God is in. I think that that's something that we can trust the Spirit to bring about in its own way. But it's so much more than just swapping facts back and forth, false facts, alternative facts. It's an
not
encounter.
Efficient. It's
not efficient at all.
It's slow.
It's slow, and it really it deepens entrenchment. into conspiracy theory. So don't do that. Like, if we can say one thing clearly, like, don't argue in that way, because it does actually just further deepen those divides. We've already said it, but asking the questions. The one thing that I think I've used this before, but just this metaphor to help people conceive of the work is putting pebbles in people's shoes. I don't know what that looks like. It may not be a fact. It may be the ethos of the way that someone feels when they're in your presence. In a way of, hey, this is safe. I don't have to have my guard up. It's the family divides are real. And we don't have to diminish the consequences of our moment by refusing to have conversations, but we can be people who are never offended. We can be people who are endlessly curious and confident that given a hearing, the word of God is something that is going to ruin our chosen and cherished narratives for what we think is at stake. Because I don't think what we think is at stake is actually at stake. And that sort of encounter and transformation is what I think my work is hopefully geared up towards. So
Beautiful. Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much. This sparked a lot of thoughts in me and things that I want to go wrestle through. And I'm sure it did for our listeners as well. I really look forward to your book coming out. So we'll be sure to post about that when the time comes, or maybe even have you back.
Sounds great. I'll hopefully have more to say when it's all said and done.
I think you probably will. I'm sure you're learning things as you go.
Yeah.
To be honest, we kind of all are at this point.
Yes.
But please go subscribe to Jared's Substack, keep up with his work, and reach out to us. Send us an email if there was something in this episode that sparked curiosity in you or questions that you have. I'd love to continue this conversation. All right. Thanks, Jared.
Thanks so much for having me on.